Welcome, everyone. It is so great to have you all here. My name is Sally Phelps, and I am the Director of External Programs and Partnerships at Olin, with a focus on alumni engagement. Welcome to Frank Talks, which is our monthly series featuring alumni doing good in the world. I just wanted to let you all know we will be recording tonight's session. Tonight, I am really excited to introduce Andy Pethan, class of 11, who'll be talking to us about designing meaningful K-12 learning experiences. When Andy was at Olin back in the early days, around 2006, he and a group of 5 other students created a group independent study that looked at Olin from several different disciplinary angles. This kicked off his deep interest in studying how people learn. A couple years later, Andy joined another group of 5 peers on a year-long leave of absence to work on a middle school education-focused startup. At this time, LOAs were not very common, and I think he drove our school a little bit crazy, he and his friends, but it was awesome. Today, each of those 6 alumni is doing some pretty impressive work, some of those still in the field of education. Andy graduated from Olin with an E with computing degree and has continued to be obsessed with how young people learn and how schools function. Unsatisfied with what he could learn as an observer on the outside, Andy entered a graduate teacher prep program in Minnesota and started student teaching as a high school math teacher right after graduation. Andy stayed in Minnesota for 8 years with his wife and growing family, moved abroad for a year, and then transitioned back to his hometown of Appleton, Wisconsin. Today, he works part-time remotely for 3 organizations, all in the education space, and spends time with his wife and 4 children. Please join me in welcoming Andy. Great to have you, Andy. Take it away.
Well, thank you, Sally. I'm really excited to do this. It's been a while since I've been able to give any kind of talk, and I know that I'm not the best about participating online all the time, so I miss the Olin community in various ways, and so it's really great to be able to do this. I'll jump in right away. Quick little background on me and learning, specifically starting at Olin. As Sally mentioned, there was a group independent study I worked on, really studying Olin from disciplinary context, things like that. And that kicked off this fascination with how learning communities work, how systems of learning happen, how specifically information is transmitted, and how deeper learning is built in our minds. That led to a Wellesley course in education that led to taking a leave of absence, that led to several different components that came after that with my scope project, Oz Capstone, all these things that were part of Olin. The cynical side of me looks at these pictures and is like, I basically, tried to figure out how education worked by arranging Post-it notes first in circles, and then by senior year, I could put them in nice like grids and stuff. But we all know that that's a beautiful part of kind of the expansive thinking we were able to do in that process. And so I'm going to pause for a quick second because I realize my notes are not moving along with me on my slides. So give me just a quick second to get that adjusted. Someone else throw some popcorn out real quick. All right. Is that better? Okay. So after graduation, I got married, went up to Minnesota, and decided that I really needed to immerse myself in a school on a daily basis to understand the things that I was trying to understand in so many ways at Olin. So did a 1-year teacher prep program for people with different backgrounds, and ended up at this small school in rural Minnesota. And I it was supposed to be a 1-year thing, and then I figured I'd move out to Boston or somewhere, literally anywhere else. And I just fell in love with the place and the people there, and got sucked in for the next 7 years. And that was kind of my laboratory where I just was really able to try everything I could think of for a number of years. Had incredible mentorship, just great community to continue to learn and try things. I also got sucked into helping to start an FRC team. And since I feel like I graduated from Olin College of Education with like a very small side dish of engineering, I actually had no idea how mechanical design worked. But I had a number of students teach me a lot of things really fast, and it was really great. And so this was also kind of my immersion in passion-based learning and trying to structure learning experiences, without the coercion of grades, and motivate students to be able to not just participate in this team, but to really grow in their skills and continue to learn. After several years of teaching, my family decided that we were going to all move back to Wisconsin, but since we were going to be changing jobs and moving homes, we figured why not leave the country for a year. And so during that time, got to do some local things, but I also was able to take on a couple of remote jobs, both Olin connected, and I'm still involved with both of them right now. First one, Center for Curriculum Redesign, or CCR, involves Charles Fidel, who is on the Olin President's Council. Really gave me the language and structure to communicate a lot of what I do, as far as how one can structure goals for building good learning experiences, things like that, and just adds a lot more research to everything that was maybe starting to become more intuitive, but could now start to back up the key parts of that. And Stage One Education is actually a startup from Oliner Andy Berry, one of the other Andys of the class of 2010. And he accidentally kind of stumbled into this company by creating a workshop and a talk for a group that happened to be running this summer camp at Olin. And that's, in the meantime, blossomed into this larger company. And now he is running these workshops year round, and I've been able to be involved with teaching and working on that. A little more on them later. These are my most dear and near school that I run out of my house. I found all 4 of these children in my wife's belly, and she was, ready to bring them into our family. And so Chris and I have been raising Josie, who's my 8-year-old in the middle, and then Lucas, Juliana, and Eliana. And this picture captures some aspect of their daily personality as well, with my wild child and my screamer and my smart smirker and my responsible child there in the middle. But they all have all kinds of different moments and moods, and to classify them as one thing would be enormously a gross mistake. So they're super fun, and really they're where I have my main passion and time being spent these days. But yeah, they're a big part of my learning journey as well. So I think they're super relevant, not just to my personal life, but really my professional life. Jumping in, I want to walk through a few different components here, and the experience piece is actually the least important. So I put it in brackets just to have a little bit of truth in advertising at this point, now that I still do on coming here to learn about experience design. Because I really think that how you situate a learning experience sets up whether it's going to work well or not. Those are the details that matter. So with an experience design, you first really have to check where your motivation is coming from and look at the big picture outcomes you're after. We'll probably spend the most time on specific learning outcomes, and we can dive into more of that with some of the questions later, if you'd like. The assessment piece is really about making sure that all of the things that you thought were the outcomes are actually being measured and checked, so that not just this time, but also over time, you can continue to make that better. And of course, provide feedback to students in the actual learning process. And then I put at the end the relationships. It's kind of part of a bigger box of how do you deliver a learning experience, which is more than just relationships. But relationships are such a key fundamental part of it that really want to focus on that first. And I think everything else about the delivery process can kind of flow out of those relationships. So where is your motivation coming from? Like most things, whenever you set up a trade-off like this, it's not a clean-cut one or the other, or just a purely linear spectrum. But I think a lot of times it's easy to analyze if it's more of a learner-driven motivation or a stakeholder-driven motivation for a particular experience. So, for example, public schools, generally more stakeholder-driven, right? Society, the local community, they want to make sure that you have childcare so that the adults can work. You want to have an able workforce in the future. So you want to educate students to learn job skills and be productive in society. You want to have an informed electorate so that you can not be in our current political climate. You want to be able to teach your community values. And there's a certain amount of value education that happens in the public school system. And so all of those things are like stakeholder goals, and the stakeholder might be more motivated for a particular ninth grader to take Algebra 1 than the student is. But in other contexts, the learner is coming in with the dominant motivation. So if you are signing up for electives or taking a summer camp activity, whatever it might be a very learner-driven thing, and the stakeholder might actually not be as vested. So you get these weird balances. And you also have just like the fact that humans have a natural curiosity to learn, right? That's a learner motivation. Learners want to spend time with friends, and a lot of times their friends are with them at school. You want to prepare for your own future. So if you're looking towards a future job and you work backwards, you're like, oh, well, then I probably need this kind of college degree, which means I need to get these kinds of grades and understand these things in high school. You have some external motivation, some extrinsic motivation, motivating you to do well in a particular learning experience. So it's not always just the stakeholder, even in a school setting. A lot of times the learner is bringing in quite a bit of their own motivation. So it's useful to analyze per student sometimes, and at least per class, where your different motivations lie. Switching gears just a little bit from the stakeholders' perspective, you want to think about the big picture outcome. And so if you only think about this in terms of content, right? When you're thinking about outcomes, if you're only thinking about it in terms of content, you tend to box yourself in to some of the other things you're trying to achieve. And then you forget when you get to the assessment part later to be able to measure it. And so with the big picture outcome, the first kind of balance I like to look at is the inspiration versus understanding. And I feel like this is best highlighted in those summer workshops. I teach some summer camp workshops with Andy Berry's company, and they are very shamelessly focused on inspiring kids to enjoy engineering. It is not about understanding the content. If students left that workshop understanding zero content, we would not lose any sleep over it. But if they were not inspired by anything that just happened, we would be desperately changing what we're doing. And so in that context, inspiration is the primary focus. And we want to make sure that things are fun, things are engaging, things are interesting. And if it doesn't lead to any real conceptual understanding, so be it. Obviously, it's not a bad thing, but it's not our focus. So you have to know your big picture outcome. On the other side, times where you might want to focus more on the understanding is if you have students in a class and the next class they're going to take has skills from your class as a prerequisite, you're setting them up for failure if you don't make sure that they have solid understanding. If you're preparing for a job that needs certain skills and you're not making sure that the learners in your group are actually understanding things, they're going to struggle in their job, might even lose their job. That'd be back on you as an instructor. Or if your institution is providing some kind of certification or transcript, and that's supposed to mean something, you can't just say, oh, well, my students are really excited about physics. Well, did they learn any physics? Maybe not. I don't know. That matters if you are giving them a stamp of approval that says they do know physics. So you have to have some transparency and honesty with that. So that inspiration understanding balance really depends on your context. Uh, Another trade-off for those of you that are Woody Flowers fans, training versus education. So quick example of that would be mechanical design might be education, while CAD is training, right? You can't do a lot of mechanical design without learning CAD. So it's not like training is unnecessary and should be replaced, but any particular CAD software that you learn is going to become outdated at some point, right? It's the conceptual ideas about your mechanical design process and how you approach that that are going to stick with you a lot longer than any training that you receive in the support of your education. And so whenever you're designing your experience, just make a very conscious effort to think about, am I just trying to get someone trained in something so that they can maybe get started on something tomorrow, like a job training program where they need to start next week? That might be a context where it's great and okay to do just training. But if you're a university providing a 4-year education and you're doing a lot of training instead, then you're really not offering your students anything that's going to last them and stick with them in the long term. So you need to decide, when is it appropriate for training, when for education, when do I need to blend both, and how do I blend? And then a final trade-off I like to think about in that big picture outcome is the head and heart balance. So a heady focus is going to be more of like clean conceptual understanding, like I'm in a PhD program and everything should like check out in certain ways. What you would traditionally think of as like the academic side of things. That's kind of the heady thing. Whereas a hearty focus is more about creating passion, creating perspective change in people. And just as like an extreme example, I kind of mentioned it before, but the current political climate would be a lot of passion without necessarily a lot of critical thinking, for example. A lot of people have heart, but they're not using the head piece as well. And so you need to make sure that, right, all heady is kind of inert and dead learning, but all heart, you aren't really thinking critically about what you're doing. So you're trying to balance these two pieces so that people can have some energy behind what they're doing. So again, check back here. The part that I really want to dive into is this next part. We got the motivation, big picture outcome, but specific learning objectives, the specific outcomes that you're after, you can break it down a lot of different ways. And when I'm designing learning experiences, this is where I camp out for a really long time. So kind of diving in, I like to break it down into these components. As Oliners know, it's a model. There's a million models for things. All models are broken, but some models are useful. This one I think is really useful. It's been heavily informed by the group I work with, Center for Curriculum Redesign. So a lot of these ideas I'm stealing straight out of their books and kind of use on a daily basis with my work as well.
Andy, can I jump in with a question?
Absolutely.
In the chat, Shaylin and Ryan are wondering, how is head heart different from understanding inspiration?
So it's there's obviously a lot of overlap between those kind of breakdowns, but the way I would primarily say that is head and heart is more about like knowing and taking action, whereas inspiration and understanding is a little bit more of what do I understand now versus what am I going to seek to understand in the future? What am I motivated to seek more learning about? So yeah, especially with the head side of head heart and the no, I gotta zoom back here. But in the understanding side of inspiration and understanding, the head and understanding are more similar. The inspiration is more about like future understanding, and heart is more about like taking action or behaving differently. Is probably how I best say that. Any other questions? Okay. So kind of jumping into some of these learning outcomes, I like this model here. I'll just answer one more question real quick. So curriculum can be designed so that understanding creates inspiration. It absolutely can. And in fact, there's a lot of times where I teach confirmation classes and it's like, oh, you can't you can't love what you don't understand. And so even in like a religious context, if you're teaching something, you need to have a certain baseline knowledge in order to grow in passion for certain things. But a lot of times people assume that you need too much of that, and they're afraid to let someone do something interesting or get passionate instead of providing scaffolding to get them there faster. So there's just a bias in general about avoiding letting people do anything interesting until they have a lot of understanding. So I think in general, try to err on the side of getting someone into an interesting context too fast rather than too slowly. So I'll just kind of jump ahead a little bit. Specific learning outcomes with this model. This skills character meta learning piece, I find really interesting. These are these transferable competencies that can last you a lifetime. And they're things that usually are practiced in school implicitly, but they're not always explicitly taught. And I guess what I mean by that, things like skills would include creativity, critical thinking, communication, collaboration. You like do it in school, but no one's doing a really good job in most schools, really trying to intentionally teach you a process to do creativity, a process by which you can be a more critical thinker, things like that. Communication's handled a little bit better in the ELA subjects, but there's a mix there. So character gets at things like ethics and courage, kind of informs how you make decisions. Meta learning is more the reflection, growth mindset, the learning process itself, so that you can be a lifelong learner and continue to get better at learning. And when you build up those skills in your learners, it pays. It's the kind of a compounding interest effect on student learning, right? If they're a better communicator, they're able to talk with their teacher to work out problems. If they're a more critical thinker, they don't need to memorize everything because they can figure things out. If you are reflective, you can get better at what you're doing instead of staying constant. And so these competencies are really important to building up your ability to learn, not just in the moment, like while you're a younger student in school, but throughout your lifelong learning. You will continue, especially if you keep getting better at these things, you'll be very effective in your job, and you'll also be a better learner. In the organization I'm with, CCR, we break these down into 12 competencies, 60 sub-competencies, so that we can get past the hand-wavy, like, I am doing communication today. It's like, well, how are you teaching that? It's like, oh, well, I'm learning how to ask questions and actively listen. Okay, well, that's a lot more concrete. And you could imagine designing some activities to help students get better at asking questions and get better at active listening. And so it tries to take these very vague things and break it down into these actionable components. And so as an organization, I think that framework they put out is really, really helpful. Concepts are probably my favorite area I could just talk for days on it, but I won't. So the example that's probably best to explain this is exponential functions are deceiving, then explosive. So at a very basic level, that concept sticks in your mind. Oh, deceiving, then explosive. Okay, well, what does that mean? It's like, okay, if you unpack that a little bit, it's like, if you're having multiplying growth, right? If you double the amount of money you have every day, it's not until the last 2 days that anything noticeable or interesting happens to that curve. Because it's just like, oh, I have 1 penny, then I have 2 pennies, and I have 4 pennies. Irrelevant, right? And then the third grader that you show that to is like, whoa, I have $1 million. When did that happen, right? It's deceiving, then explosive. That concept, though, if you get that concept, you start to train your brain to detect it in other places. And so even though it belongs to a small corner of mathematics, you might notice it all around you. So the first part of teaching concepts is to train learners to recognize something in new places, right? It's not just in the math textbook when the curve looks like this, that we're dealing with an exponential function. Now you can start to recognize it, in a new situation, like studying a virus or whatever. And that's called transfer. So the idea of kind of efficiency in learning is that you can learn a certain number of concepts and then transfer them both near and far to better understand something else, right? Sometimes we use the word lenses of how we're going to analyze a problem or questions we're going to ask about something. Lenses are usually attached to some conceptual idea that we use to look at a particular problem. And when we start looking at new problems through those lenses, we are transferring that understanding to a new situation. And all of a sudden, all the learning we did in one domain can help us in another. And so one really important piece of a good education, not training, but a good education, is to pick out what are your concepts and how can we apply them all over. And then the content circle is kind of the leftover of the traditional learning after you've pulled out those big ideas. And so in the like education training balance, it's more of the training side, which also means that it's probably the quicker to expire piece of your curriculum that you're designing. So if you're building a learning experience that has some core concepts and then just kind of the rest of this content, the rest of that content might get replaced 5 years from now, but the core concepts are probably going to stick around for a long time. And so they're the sticky parts, the transferable parts, the parts that even will transcend disciplinary boundaries. But the content will tend to fade as technology and society are changing and evolving. That part's going to tend to be less sticky. So outside of all of those big three goal types is context. And so I don't really consider these goals, but because they're necessary in the process of building learning experiences, it's useful to be aware of what they are and even list them when you're creating your goals. Because if you are, right, if you're spelling out like, okay, this is what I want to do, these are the concepts I want students to learn, this is the content that's really important, and this character development should happen, this meta learning should happen, things like that. The context would be the examples that you use. So in math, if you're doing the concept of exponentials, your content might be like the growth and decay functions, the bases and constants, your different graphing techniques, graphing technology. You might choose to focus on like organizing information as part of critical thinking, as part of your skills area. But then the context could be radioactive decay for carbon dating, the spread of disease, Moore's law, number of views on an Instagram video, stuff like that. They're just like the examples that you work from in an English class. It might be the book you're reading, right? And so your context, those in the same way that content might need to change out every 5-10 years or something because it can become dated, context might need to be changed out every single time you teach the course because it might no longer be relevant or engaging to your particular audience. Context can become dated really fast. And that's okay, right? Like in the middle of COVID, virus spread is super fascinating, but like 2 years later, you know, students might be like, are we still talking about viruses? Like, can we talk about something else at school today? And you might need to, in order to engage your students, you might need to change the context. And so that is an area that I like to put out of the side because if you're thinking of your goals as the things that you're going to want to measure and optimize for, you don't want to optimize for the context. It's just a space to play in, to practice, to learn, to talk about the ideas. You need to have one at any given time, but which one you have is really not super important. And so there are rare occasions where the context is maybe more important. So like English teachers tend to say Shakespeare is an essential context. You can't teach English class without Shakespeare. It's like, well, you could, but yeah, you're right. You probably shouldn't, I guess, even though, yeah, whatever. And so there are times where you might say, no, for this reason or another, I really want this context to be part of my goals. But generally, I try to avoid it. On the other side, another thing that's not a goal, but is part of that instructional design process are your strategies. So like, I'll broaden this a little bit, but I want to use a project to teach, right? That's my instructional approach is to do project-based learning. Okay, that's great. That's not a goal. That's a method, right? That's how I'm going to deliver these concepts, this content, these skills, character, meta learning. It's a delivery mechanism. It might be a very good one. It might be a very good one for a particular audience, but you're not going to assess students on did they do this as a project. And if you start grading their project instead of their conceptual learning, their content learning, their skills learning, stuff like that, all of a sudden your assessment starts to kind of veer off track, and you're grading how well they paper mache in a physics class, right? It's really important to focus your goals on those type of things, and then the instructional strategies are going to be the method that you go back to later as you design your experiences. So kind of quick recap, I spend a lot of my time in these big three because they set up, I feel like, everything else I do. And without having those, it's you tend to float in the wind, especially when students aren't responding well to what you're doing. You're not really sure what to stay anchored to. And so it's less about the initial design and more about the fact that when you start changing things later, if you don't have these really solid and really trust that they're good, you're going to start waffling on even your core things that you're teaching to the detriment of your course. Jump straight to assessment. We kind of talked about some of these ideas already. But you really need to design your assessments before you design your learning experiences. Before you design it. A lot of times it's like, oh, I'm going to do this project. Oh, how in the world are we going to grade kids when we're done with this? Like, no. Like, you might have a concept in your head of like what you want to do for your project, your lecture-based lessons, whatever it is that you're going to do for your instructional delivery and practice. But you want to design as much of that assessment as you can in advance. Like, what are the questions that you would ask a student to understand if they understand? What are the observations as an instructor that you would make before they start doing something, so that you can be looking for those in class? You don't need to always have a piece of paper where you grade it or grade a presentation. Sometimes you can just walk around and notice certain things that they're doing or knowing. Knowing is harder to measure from just observation, but you can look at what they do and how that reflects what they know. So if you design your assessment piece really well in advance, that's helpful. It's also helpful because sometimes, going back to those early assumptions, if you're really focused on inspiration, your assessment should not be rooted in these goals. They should be rooted in, like, things like, did students have fun today? Did students tell a friend to sign up for the next workshop? I had a student not too long ago who I saw took a job in data science, just graduated college. And that was the point of my statistics class, was to inspire students. And that student loved that class, engaged in that class, and now is a data scientist. So that would be an affirmation of, that's the kind of assessment I should have been thinking about from the beginning. And when students weren't doing as well with certain types of assessment, it shouldn't have bothered me quite as much. So I need to be clear on what things I'm actually measuring in what context, because otherwise you focus on the data you have instead of the data you intended to have. So design your assessments before. Realizing that your results inform your future iterations of the experience is really, really how you iterate. Because if you're not studying your assessments and their results to figure out what to do next on the next iteration of a course, usually when I think of experiences, I think of experiences that are going to repeat and have new versions in the future. So that's, if you're doing a one-off experience, it's a little harder to maybe like care about some of these things because you're not rooted in that long-term continuous improvement. But the single reason why my mentor teachers won a national award was because they did this process incredibly well. They figured out what they had to measure, and they measured it continuously for like 7 years. And every year, 7 years with like 2 courses a year. So on 14 iterations, they had all of the data points of students overall growing, and they would tweak just little pieces of different lessons throughout the year based on these little pieces of feedback they gathered from analyzing their data in a very systematic, kind of grindy way. And that continuous improvement just really paid off. And so realizing that you're designing your assessments as your baseline for how you're going to iterate really can set you up for trusting those assessments and digging into them. Don't assess the things that are not goals. said it a little bit earlier, but again, if you're measuring a bunch of stuff that you actually don't care about, then it's going to lead you astray. Also, it's not fair to students if you start measuring things that are not really the goal. So like your context, if you're reading this particular book, but you're really studying like themes in literature, and your assessment questions are about facts of what's happening in the book, other than checking like, did they read, which is more of a behavioral thing, it's not fair to assess that because it doesn't matter what book they read. You care if they can approach a new book and still do those things. So both from a fairness perspective and from a like not guiding yourself astray as an instructor and instructional designer, make sure that you're not going too far astray. I'll just pause here. Quick question. Venn diagram in the model, would you use it to create goals for a course? Yes. So I think of those different components. They definitely have overlap. There are, I try to break them up in those ways, but there are absolutely things that cross. That's why thus the everything touches Venn diagram type of thing. But yeah, the more you can break it down into those things, it gives you some very concrete things to hit. And then you can look at best ways to do that. So when putting together an experience, I'll say, okay, well, I want to address a sub-competency 3 times in a unit. That's like kind of like a best practice thing that we think that we're trying right now. Or I want to have no more than 2 concepts in a unit, because any more than that, and there might be tons of concepts present, but only focus and explicitly call out 2 of them, because any more than that is cognitive overload and they won't really focus on any of them. Stuff like that. So all of these kind of have some best practices maybe attached to them, and that's why, yeah, absolutely use this to break down my goals. Another question: how do you balance trying something new but potentially better versus using something you know that works now when there's real kids and real education? That's a good question. I biased towards trying something new and potentially better way more than I should have, at the detriment of real kids and their real education. And I learned that the hard way by watching real kids struggle at real things. The nice thing is I think everyone has a different tolerance point for that. And so there are teachers that are never going to try something new. Well, not never, but like are much more resistant to trying something new. That can kind of anchor what has historically worked and bring back the crazies like me. And then there's a few that are willing to try almost anything. And they stumble on some interesting things once in a while and share those, but then let the other bad ideas die. And so there's always, because, right, you're not the only educator, especially for high school, where students see 4 to 8 teachers a day. There's having one teacher that's a little out there is not going to ruin their education. And in fact, might inspire them to a new career. But having too many curmudgeonese, not try anything teachers, if you have 1 or 2 of those, you'll get by. And so I think having a mixed balance of instructors working together on different parts of that spectrum and kind of reining each other in and being honest about their biases towards too much of this or too much of that is probably best practice. So yeah. I'll keep jumping ahead. Last thing with assessment, try to use the most authentic assessments possible. And what that really means is just whatever real practice looks like in the content area, to the extent that it's feasible. So if you're doing software development and the way that someone would assess your work is through a demo and a code review, then you should do, if possible, with your computer science students, demos and code reviews, right? Where you're looking at, like, does it work? How did you document things? How did you structure things? Like, can another human being come in and make any sense of what you just did? These types of questions in that type of context is an authentic assessment of how someone doing software development could, in the real world, get assessed for doing software development. So why not assess them that way in a classroom context? On the other hand, though, it's usually the more authentic it is, the more manual, time-consuming it's going to be, and time works against you, because one of the most important things and a learning experience is high feedback frequency. And that's one of the things at Olin, actually, I felt like was an area that Olin professors were not as strong, is we had very low frequency of feedback in certain ways. And so the more that you can have some automated, like auto-graded things or any kind of digital assessment for more basic stuff, it's going to be useful because you can say, I think it's this, try it, instantly know that it's wrong. I can correct it and move forward instead of just like, well, I guessed this on the test. I hope it's right. A month from now, I'll find out if it is or not. At that point, I don't even care. I just look at the number on top and see how I did and move on. And so the speed of feedback is relevant. And so authentic assessments are not always good, but you need to anchor every good course in a few of those. So kind of went through a lot of that setup piece. I really think that those are the big building blocks, and I'm happy to dive into any more in more detail. I tried to make this as short as possible so that we could get into more questions, but the experience piece, I really think has incredible freedom to be designed here at this point, where as long as you have your context that you're willing to try and different instructional methods that you get some training on and are willing to employ in a classroom, as long as they're anchored in really good outcomes and assessment, you have so many things you can try, and you just have to know your audience. You, like, every teacher is going to know their students differently. Curriculum developers are going to know their content area in a way that hopefully can lend itself to generally authentic experiences, but which is why I'm going to jump kind of straight into the relationship component here. So one thing I used to do with my students was I'd play this little 16-second video at the start of the year. And so in a matter of 16 seconds, I can say, this is who I am, this is my name, this is my dog, this is my wife, here's my toilet if you care, and let's get to know each other, right? Let's be friends. And as I got a bigger family, I would, I'd be able to involve all of them, right? And introduce a little bit of myself in just a few seconds, right? I don't need to, nobody can stand the teacher that's just like, oh, this is me and this is my summer vacation. And, it's just like, oh, it's cringeworthy, right? But if in a very quick burst, you can be like, hi, I'm a real human being. I live with real human beings. I act like a real human being. We're going to learn together this year. That can be really helpful and powerful. Let's pull this back up. I did the same thing in the opposite direction. And the first assignment I would do in a lot of my classes would be to say, show me a picture of you doing something that you love doing. That was like the assignment. And then tell me what you're doing. And students would they post all kinds of stuff. Like, nobody had a hard time finding a picture of them doing something that they liked doing and would love to talk about it. And just like that, these 25, 30 kids in this room, I do not know, are now all willing to share stories from their personal life with me, who they met like an hour ago. And so there are certain very intentional things in the relationship building, like right from the start of the year, like this. It's an online assignment. They all knew that other students in the class would be able to see it, and everyone had to comment on one other person's picture. And so there was instantly some community getting built, right? And we haven't even used a minute of class time to do this. This is a homework assignment. No one minded doing it. And you're building some relationships with them. You now have something to look at, like, and say, oh, karate tournament, tell me more. When are you going next? Whatever it is. Like, do you like to travel a lot? You like hiking? Like, where do you go? And that by just having that next question, you can continue that conversation, build that relationship kind of throughout the year. Jumping into the learning experience design in the context of building relationships. This was a class of students where I think over a third was failing and the rest was like C or below type of thing. Like, it was really not good. This was my first semester as a student teacher. And I was like, okay, they're gonna fire me before the end of the year. This is gonna be before the end of the semester. I got to do something. So pushed all the desks aside. We all sat on the floor in a big circle and we just like talked about our feelings one day. And I was like, okay, I don't think you guys are working very hard. And they're like, this is really boring and irrelevant to my life. And they're like, yeah, it is. But you got to suck it up, guys. And kind of came to that point of like, okay, we'll tell you what, I'm gonna go home tonight and think on it. And next week we're gonna try some different things, but I need you to all step it up too. And then I held to my side of the bargain and they held to theirs. And right, so it's like, okay, we're gonna play some games. And right, that girl right there had like a 30% in the class and is taking diligent notes right now and actually finished writing a full paper about this experience with scientific references all over and stuff. So it's just like, it was really awesome to be able to engage students in the learning experience, but it was a relational thing because while they're doing this in class, I'm walking around just laughing at them and with them. We'll say with them. But it was really it was a positive culture building experience for the class with each other, for the class with me, for me with individual students that I had as I was able to have conversations on a daily basis. And in general, the structure of a class, if I'm allowed to just walk around and talk to people all day, instead of being up front where I can't have conversations, all of a sudden my ability to form relationships is massively multiplied. Why do we take students to the gym? Because this group of ninth graders can't sit still, so they needed to run around, honestly. But we were working on both probability, and then later we talked about it in the context of quadratic functions. And so what is the probability you're going to make each shot? Okay, can we assume that it's independent for every free throw you take? How many do you make? 0 out of 10? Okay, well, that's harder to analyze, but whatever it is. And you get students to start to ask questions that they hadn't asked before, start to find some things like, oh, well, I guess it's kind of relevant because I do play basketball. I have wondered like how often people make shots. And so you start to make connections on the content side, but more so, you're running around passing a ball in a context where they feel comfortable instead of in a desk in a classroom. And you're able to create these new cultural experiences for your class.
Andy, there's a question in the chat. I'll read it to you. Kelly says, I'm a biologist. I built a Montessori science curriculum for K-6 kids, including mine, and taught it for 15 years. Any thoughts on teaching science and STEM related concepts to students under the age of 12? One thing I learned the hard way, do not use metaphor with students younger than 6. Also at those ages, awe, enlightenment, and inspiration always trump content mastery. These qualities build lifelong learners. Yes.
Well, in the context of even just like where I'm at right here, right? There's a lot of, when you create an experience where there are positive relationships going on, where you can be a trusted adult in that environment. So if you're just building curriculum and someone else is teaching it, and it's a little different if you yourself are teaching it, then you're thinking more from a personal standpoint. And I've been able to do both. But from the context of developing curriculum for someone else, yeah, you want to stay in the concrete with younger kids. You can get increasingly abstract as you go out, but conceptual understanding has to be grounded in reality at some point. Like, you can't just teach a concept without teaching the real world content of what's happening. You abstract a concept out of, I'm going to do a concrete example, I'm going to do a related concrete example, I'm going to do a third related concrete example. What is the thing that pulls these together? And as you get older, you can do that at farther reaching distances. But even with younger kids, you can have those concrete experiences, even if later on they can go back and draw on those in order to make conceptual understanding happen. So maybe they have an experience in 3rd grade that's very concrete and very memorable and very inspiring and motivating. A few years later, they're like, oh, biology, that's awesome. I remember I did this thing and they called it biology, so that must be this thing. and they draw on that experience, which motivates them to, pay attention to the teacher when they're talking. Gets them to read some of the things they're supposed to read, to do some of the activities more carefully than they would have otherwise. So there's that motivation piece, which is obviously just going to then be helpful in that particular experience. But then that experience is going to say, what are the conclusions? And you're like, well, the teacher didn't necessarily provide enough in that 7th grade experience to really draw deep, meaningful conclusions. But because of the other concrete, memorable experiences they had in 3rd grade, they combine those to now form their new understanding, which is going to be a little bit more conceptually broad and encompassing of both. And so I think to some extent, don't be like ashamed or afraid of having too concrete of experiences, because especially if it's motivating and interesting, because it's going to be useful later, especially if it's memorable. If it's not memorable, then it doesn't matter because they forget it. But yeah, if you're doing something that's really cool, and hands-on and fun, which is more likely to help it stick, then I think that's okay. Opinion. But yeah, no, last slide with relationships here, and we'll kind of open it up to questions in general. But even in the mundane and boring, you can have a lot of relations, right? So like factoring is my favorite thing to rip on in the public education system, because it just is. But I can, from across the room, see her writing on this whiteboard versus her notebook. So I encourage her to write with a big black marker on the whiteboard, so that when I'm helping someone else on the other side of the room, I can be like, Sammy, don't do it. And she can just look at me and look at her board and have that face of like, oh, there's something wrong. I don't know what it is, but I know he saw something that's wrong, and then figure out what to do. And what's cool about that is it builds that relationship and trust, because she knows that I care. She knows that I'm watching and helping, but I'm also letting her struggle enough to say, okay, I'm going to figure it out myself, right? Like, she's on the path to a factoring mistake here, if you can tell. But what's really cool about that dynamic is it also creates a class culture where now students are helping each other, where they're looking over and be like, oh yeah, check this. They're like, and trying to coach them on like, how do you help a peer? Like, not telling them the answer. How do you actually help somebody, where you're not giving them too little that they're just frustrated, but too much that they're not learning? And so a lot of those dynamics just involve finding ways to create time to be with students in semi-structured environments where they have stuff to do and things to work on, but you can walk around, have conversations, build relationships, get them to trust you. Especially, like, I taught a lot of remedial classes where the motivation for the stakeholder is very high and the motivation for the student is usually not very high. And especially in those contexts, if they trust you, they'll at least be willing to do something for you. And sometimes you make them come in and sit next to you at lunch, and they're like, I don't want to be here. And you're like, oh, me neither. That's great. I was hoping to eat my lunch with my peers today, but since you didn't get this done, let's see if we can make some progress. And they can see that you care enough to make your own sacrifices for them, which like legitimately requires making sacrifices, right? But like, there's joy in it. I enjoy being with my students because those relationships were just, I don't know, they were just fun as I got to know them more and more. So I think that really is a big piece of teaching in general, right? If you're doing curriculum development like I do now, or did recently, I guess, you're not in that direct contact with students. You don't have that relational component, but what you need to be thinking is, somebody is going to use this curriculum and need to build relationships while they use it. How am I creating time in the curriculum and experiences that will facilitate teachers making relationships with students? Because if I'm not making time for that, then my curriculum is setting up the teacher for failure. So that's kind of the context I always go back to, is our relationships being formed here? So yeah, and happy to dive in more on the experiences part. I don't want to cheat anyone out of that if they were really looking for that, but I really think situating it in all these pieces is a far more important piece of that. So open it up to some just general questions.
Andy, you went to an engineering college. When did you decide that you weren't going to be an engineer?
Sophomore year.
Sophomore year.
Pretty early on. But to be fair, I am employed doing software design right now. So I sort of became an engineer by accident. So one of those things that happens to the best of us.
Feel free to write your questions in the chat or just speak right up. What were you going to say, Andy? Sorry.
I was going to say all the engineering I do is in the context of education. So designing tools to map learning goals and assess learning goals, and to working with Marco right now on a startup he's involved with, and get to help out with how do you facilitate kind of organizing all of these online classes and teachers, things like that. So in the workshops I do with Andy Barry, again, very focused on like how do we inspire students in STEM. So it all ties together. All right. Yeah. No, Kelly, that's a good point. Overall trajectory, yeah, it's very much loaded up with Olin-ness from the start. And I feel like I got to have an education experience while I was an Olin student, really all 4 years, plus the bonus year that I wanted to have. So really all 5 years within Olin, I was getting absolutely immersed in the education world, including, right, our engineering professors, right, John Stoke and Jenya and several others that taught me a lot and gave me a lot of, suffering and feedback. I mean, yeah, feedback, not suffering, feedback around improving lesson design and improving measurement and all these things. So yeah, absolutely. Hayden says, mathematics education, especially in public schools, tends to perform poorly in creating both deep understanding and inspiration. Fact. How would you suggest making mathematics more interesting and improve understanding in schools? Well, I thought about that question for a really long time. One answer, there's a lot of pieces to it. I will say going off the deep end with just trying to be fun and crazy all the time and not having any real grounded learning is not the answer. Staying the order the textbook provides things in all the time, definitely also not the answer. So there is definitely a hybrid to those ideas. But one of the more motivating pieces, I think, is to teach the competencies through math. And that's what I've been able to do at CCR. So we will teach critical thinking in an intentional way. We'll teach ethics in an intentional way through math curriculum. And so designing with those pieces in mind not only gives them lifelong transferable skills while they're in math class, but it also makes it more interesting, frankly. Along with that, choosing better context, right? Like you can only have so many rocks that go on an arc for parabola problems before you're just like, this is dumb. I don't care. You need to be able to say, okay, is there any other context that is potentially relevant or interesting, or can I do more mathematical modeling? And I think mathematical modeling, especially in the algebra arena, is one approach to teaching that I would love to see really built out well, where students learn to just like map on different functions to patterns in real data and make predictions with it, analyze their model, what fails about their model, what assumptions go into it. And that's more reminiscent of a real world process that a mathematician would use. Part of the problem with math education is that most of the stuff that students are asked to do in math class are not actually used by anybody anywhere except in math class. And so we should be better at ripping out the training that has become obsolete and keep the educational components, of which we will quickly realize how little true education we're doing. And I think the place that showed up the most was in remedial classes. Students would learn a very specific technique to solve a very narrow class of problem. And that's all they could solve. You give them something slightly different and they had no clue how to solve it because there was no transfer going. There was no conceptual understanding. No one was saying, learn this thing, learn this related thing, talk about how they're similar and different. What's the broader concept? And if you're not doing that, you're not going to see those abstractions and be able to apply a more broad transfer hammer to a new problem. For whatever reason, I don't know if it's because I just like couldn't see super well or didn't want to take notes in class, but I was able to, when I was a student, kind of in high school, listen and try to figure things out. And I would force myself to say, okay, if I don't want to write anything down, what's the least amount of effort I could apply to figure out this problem? And I would discover those things as a result. And so it wasn't that I was like born smart. I just like happened to stumble by accident on a really good set of questions for how to abstract things that helped me in my own learning. And so trying to be more explicit about teaching students things like that, because it's like, right, these are just techniques. And so we can offer some of that in math education so that honestly, students in math are usually motivated when they do well, and they're super demotivated when they do poorly. Even if the learning is completely irrelevant to anything, they don't even care. If they're doing well, they're having fun, which that blew my mind when I observed that. But it makes sense, right? You play video games. Is there any purpose to that? No. But if I'm doing well, I'm having fun. Okay. Well, if math basically becomes a game, then you want to encourage them to like get feedback early so they see their mistakes earlier so that they can then correct little things and get better at the game. So some of it is just even modifying how quickly we deliver feedback. So I think there's a lot of components to that question, but those are some of the areas of improving math education, at least high school, maybe middle school. Other questions?
Oh, hey, this has been great. Thank you so much, Andy. Thank you everyone for joining us. Oh, was there another question? Oh, no, that was the same question. Okay, great. Well, thank you, Andy. That was fantastic. And thanks to all of you who joined us tonight. I'd love to invite you to come back next month. We will have Bennett Shabbat from the class of 09 talking about his work in grid innovation with Pacific Gas and Electric out in California. Bennett's leading the team to rapidly refine and scale PG&E's remote grid program as a means to reduce wildfire risk by providing standalone power systems to rural electric customers. So just more great work that our alumni are doing. I thank you all for coming. Thank you, Andy. Round of applause for Frank Tucker.
Thank you, Sally. Thank you, Kristen. Thank you, Emily, for making this all happen. And thank you, everyone, for coming out. It was a lot of fun.
Have a great night, everyone. Thank you.